Hello, everyone. My name is David Kim, and this is the dialogue series Love-Driven Politics for Meaning of Life TV. The dialogue series is an engagement with thinkers, activists, artists, and concerned citizens and everyday folks seeking to forge a public life animated by compassion, mercy, generosity, and radical love. And I can't think of anyone more exemplary of those commitments than the great essayist and journalist Rebeccca Solnit. Rebeccca, hello, how are you?
Well, I hope I can live up to that. I'm happy to be in conversation with you.
Oh, me too. Well, let me just say a little bit about you, Rebeccca, and then I want to hear, we'll talk a bit about your roots, but also the work that you've been doing of late. As folks know that you're the author of 17 different books, you're including Wanderlust, A History of Walking, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster, a number of atlases, Infinite City, an atlas of San Francisco, Unfathomable City, an atlas of New Orleans, and of course the recently reissued Hope in the Dark, this extraordinary book of essays that has just been reissued by Haymarket Press.
To my delight, with at last the cool cover I've been wanting since 2004.
Oh, no kidding, no kidding. Can you tell me, before we talk about the book, I've been curious about your identity as an essayist and as an activist and as a journalist. I was very struck by your self-description on your website where you said an independent essayist since 1988. Right? Was this how did you come to this as a self-conception?
You know, in a way, I love that what I do is the leftover term that's called creative nonfiction, where it's like, oh, creative is like this kind of insecure booster label. Nonfiction is all the leftovers after fiction takes the crown.
Right.
And, and poetry, I guess, takes the other crown. And I like that in some ways because it means, I've claimed dictionaries, atlases, encyclopedias as territory I can work in as a writer. But I like the term essayist because it suggests that what I'm trying to do is work to a specific form, something that's not just the yardage of a blog. I always think of blogs as being like streams of toilet paper or string or toothpaste, just this kind of formless, thing coming forth. Whereas an essay is really a formal structure. It's like, it's like a vase. It's like a marble statue. It's it's a meal. It's got a beginning, a middle, and end, a structure, and that's really what I set out to be. And and I always knew I wanted to be a writer since right after I learned how to read. And then gradually in my teens, I was drawn to George Orwell, to Virginia Woolf, to the great, now largely forgotten film critic from my own part of the Bay Area, Pauline Kael.
Oh, yeah.
And later to people like, actually really early on to Jorge Luis Borges, later to people like James Baldwin, and realized that, okay, I'm going to be doing this thing that isn't what everyone talks about, that isn't the novel.
Right.
That brings with it this real commitment to telling the truth, to serving your history or community in some way. It's really kind of got a moral calling in a different way, I think. And so here I am in the middle of it, and it's kind of great when it's not completely overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you brought up those influences in genealogy, because I was thinking about Orwell and Woolf and Baldwin, and maybe even someone like Sontag, right? As I was rereading some of your work.
Too. I've got a good crew.
You do have a good crew. And it's interesting that you talk about the essay as a finished form. When I teach students about the essay, I often refer to Montaigne. And Montaigne, when he invents the form, as it were, refers to it as attempt, right? These attempts.
Exactly. And it's both. Fortunately, I'm no kind of aristocrat. I'm a hybrid Catholic Russian Jew, so I don't get a family crest or motto. But if I did, it would be something like "Je sais," I try.
That's right.
And, you probably saw my automatic message about how busy I am that says I'm doing the best I can. Yeah. But I think an essay does have form in a way that's really different than the kind of rantings, musings, journaling's a word I've never taken to blog posts, tweets, etc. There's a lot of stuff that's very kind of amorphous, and there is a sense when the try of an essay to me feels like I'm going to go explore something. I don't know where it's going to take me, but in a way, the essay is kind of the report on the expedition, whether it's an expedition into something literal. I went to the Tibetan Buddhist part of Nepal and wrote an essay for the New Yorker about that last fall. Or an essay into what happened, like the story I just did on the murder of a young Latino man in San Francisco. Or an essay about an idea, which is a lot of what I do in, for example, my Harper's column. Or the Hope in the Dark is a collection of explorations of ideas about history and power and possibility.
So can we talk about... you talked about the kind of moral vocation of the essay. So your version of the essay, right?
Yeah.
And I've been curious about what those moral sources are for you. There's clearly a strong strand of activism and an attempt to both address where the culture is, but to speak very specifically about adjustments that you're trying to render to the culture. So specifically, for example, about hope and the kind of pervasiveness of cynicism that's in our culture.
I think there's a fundamental bottom line for the nonfiction I do and the nonfiction I teach and the nonfiction I like, which is that you tell the truth. And you can recognize, we all had postmodernism sprinkled on our 80s breakfast cereals. The truth is a tricky thing. It doesn't mean you know what the truth is, but it means you're candid and honorable and principled in your operations. You try and get your facts right. You do your research. You don't get sloppy, and you recognize that you don't really own stories when they're about somebody else's life, when they're about the public record. There's lots of liberties you can take that are creative. Some liberties you can't take because they're moral, and that really matter. And so that's kind of the non-negotiable bottom line is, the artist Jess and his partner, the poet Robert Duncan, these two wonderful out gay men, a couple since early 50s in San Francisco, gave a protege of theirs an award because it was Servant of Holy Beauty.
Wow.
And part of my first book. And somehow the idea that I'm going to give someone an award or someone's going to give me an award called Servant of Holy Truth is out there.
Yeah.
Like this murder story I just wrote, I really felt like I'm, more than anyone else, I'm going to be the person writing the widely seen historical record of what happened. And it's really incumbent on me to get it right. And, so there's that. But then there's also like, what do our stories do? And I often feel like a lot of the cynical, jaded, fetchy, grouchy, grumpy mainstream culture, people aren't asking themselves that, because you look at people and it's like, oh, did you get up this morning saying, I wonder how I can make people feel more depressed and powerless? Because that's what so much of these frameworks do. It's like, what is your goal? And I don't feel like a cheerleader or, Pollyanna or, who's the guy in Candide I'm thinking of?
Dr. Pangloss.
Yeah, or Panglossian or something. Like, I'm trying to tell the truth. There's, but it's also like, like we already know there's a wall there. Is there a door? Is there a possibility of the door? That's the assignment.
Yeah, it is. And so, one of the things that's always attracted me to your writing and your thinking is your unstinting commitment to the constructive, your unstinting commitment to possibility, as opposed to, as you say, like the destructive, the negative, the cynical, the fatal. Where does that come from in your own life?
And it comes from a bunch of different things. One is, I think a lot of people who are doing that really negative stuff grew up in the mainstream. And when you grow up in the mainstream, it's funny putting your hands up on Skype. When you grow up in the mainstream, you feel like these really important stories aren't being told. And some of them are that, the police lie, corporations are corrupt, the government is, doing these terrible things they're not telling you about and stuff. And that's true, and it's really important that those stories be told, and I'm really grateful to those truth tellers. But there's also other stories that don't get told in the mainstream. It's that there are all these beautiful alternatives. There are all these extraordinary victories we have There are people whose everyday lives are incredible victories against homophobia, against racism, against the things that try and divide and defeat us. And I feel like, in a sense, if I was in a newsroom, it could be like, okay, so-and-so's on the defeat beat, we're giving you the hope beat. I felt like the defeat stuff was really, really well covered. It didn't need me in any way. And this stuff felt really neglected. Howard Zinn does it.
That's right.
And there's a number of great writers who've really gone in this direction with me, and a number of fantastic activist groups. But it felt like it wasn't how Americans knew how to tell stories. And so the defeatists are often telling stories against the mainstream. I'm telling stories often against the left's own self-destructive tendencies.
So do you have an example from your early days where it was an example that sparked that commitment to hope for you, that, gave you the capacity to resist the defeatism of the mainstream that you just described?
I think the biggest thing that ever happened to shape my philosophy happened in the 1980s. I got involved in the anti-nuclear movement. And the wonderful thing was that through, we started going to the Nevada test site where nuclear testing became this very real, tangible thing of nuclear bombs exploding at the rate of 1 a month, which is not how anybody thought about nuclear testing. And there, the Native Americans whose land it was, the Western Shoshone, showed up and said, hey, this is our land. Now, they're trespassing on it. We'll give you permits on it. Not only do we want it back, we want them to stop bombing it. And so it was really the beginning of the environmental justice movement. It was an incredibly exciting moment. And if you acknowledge the reality of Native Americans, for thousands of years in North America, you throw out the idea of virgin wilderness, you throw out the idea of discovery, you throw out the idea of this empty stuff that was waiting to be claimed. You really remake these categories as big as history, as big as nature. And I got very involved in the Western Shoshone land rights struggle, just as the quincentennial was becoming this incredible revolution against the dominant narrative of Columbus discovered America. There were some savages here, they disappeared, they're in the past tense, and the environmental movement was one of the criminals because it was framing all the places it was trying to protect as virgin wilderness, which distorted the records in ways that distorted the ecology and distorted how we could imagine ourselves. I lived through this incredible revolution, and it really gave me first the hope that people who seem really marginal, Native Americans living in remote parts of the continent, who had been told that they were extinct, that they were nobody, that they were nothing, that they were dying out, that they were irrelevant. They and scholars and activists and visionaries really pulled together a sense of the world that so profoundly made things different. When I talk to younger people, they can't quite imagine that world before 1992. That taught me that stories matter, that what we do as scholars and writers, storytellers, activists, can change the world, that the world is in this constant state of flux and we can intervene in it, and that we don't know what's going to happen next. And the climate movement right now, Native people, particularly in Canada, but all across the US too, right down to the protests yesterday against oil and gas leases in the Gulf of Mexico, Native American people were written off as some kind of irrelevant past, have become a huge part of the future hope for the world as a tremendously powerful part of the climate movement. And just the longer I was an activist, and the longer I was a reader of history and a witness, the more and more I saw these amazing things. And I wrote a book about the photographer Edward Muybridge, who sped up photography so we could see things that are too fast for the human eye to perceive. The motion of water spilling and pouring, the motions of horses' legs at a gallop, of a bird in flight. But what we mostly don't see now in our short attention span era is things that are too slow to see. And I have heard so many people say the women's movement didn't achieve anything. It's like, and you just look at them and, and it's like, do you have any idea what the status of women was 50 years ago when there was no such concept as spousal rape, sexual harassment, workplace discrimination? Do you remember when homophobia, treated being queer as either mentally ill or criminal or both. Like, do you understand how much the world has changed? You have to stay still to see change. You have to be slower than the change.
Well, you have to be slower than change. And, you've made a lot of the necessity to remember, right? That there's this amnesia, and another word for the amnesia is this kind of intensified presentism, right? That folks want to say, like, well, what's happening at this moment, detached from the past, as you say, like, the horrors of the not so distant past.
It's funny. I suddenly think we could call it the orphan present. It's not an orphan. It has ancestors, and ancestors, just as you can look at the parents and see what the child will be, at the plant and see what the seed will be. You learn a lot from these past things and what the possibilities are. And what you learn is that we don't know what will happen yet. We don't know what will happen next. One of the things that takes me aback is that people love certainty. They love certainty more than they love hope. And that is so backwards. You need to come to terms with uncertainty of the fact that we don't know what will happen next. And in that uncertainty lies the possibility of hope if we seize it. Right now we're in another hideous election season, the way that we are every 4 years. And the mass media have basically stopped reporting on the past and started reporting on the future. They're telling us who's going to win and what people think and etc. And if you remember any goddamn election we've ever had, it's like, it was a foregone conclusion Hillary Clinton was going to win the 2008 nomination. That's right. Obama was unelectable. That's right. That's right. And then, people forget these things. You learn from the past that things change dynamically, they change dramatically, and that we don't know what's going to happen next. Nobody foresaw the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. Nobody really foresaw the huge shift South Africa went through at the same period, and that when Nelson Mandela went from lifetime prisoner to president in a very fast moment. We don't know. We don't know.
We don't know. And, I was struck by your preference for the category of uncertainty over anxiety, right? And I was thinking of, if you think about if you think about someone like Orwell, for example, one of your heroes, Orwell, where he was very much writing about uncertainty, but would prefer the language of anxiety. And I think in our moment, one of the things I'm reading out of Hope in the Dark is you're cajoling us to say uncertainty is a good thing, right? That uncertainty, and we have to, what do you say? Like, we have to develop this toleration for uncertainty as opposed to foreclosing possibility.
Foreclosing, such a good word in the economic, in the wake of the economic collapse of 2008. Don't foreclose on your future. Don't foreclose on your possibilities. That's right. Yeah, it's a kind of shutdown. And one thing I keep saying, I've been saying since I started writing about hope, is that pessimism and optimism are not opposites. They are the same thing. They are certainty. And they are a certainty that says, since we know what's going to happen, we don't have to participate. And what I think part of why uncertainty scares people is that we're not afraid of being weak. We're afraid of being powerful. And uncertainty says we have the power to participate. We have the power to change the outcome. And now we better do that work.
And so is it, do you think it's folks feeling afraid to take agency in that uncertainty, to say, like, we're going to be authors of this future. We're going to, and also take responsibility for our past.
I think it's two things. I think a lot of people don't feel powerful, and everything out there is trying to tell you that you don't have the power. What electoral campaigns are about is we're all going to get behind some magic person, and that person will do it all for us, and we'll remain powerless and silent after we push them into office. And they're kind of dismal campaigns because the power people assemble around a Bernie Sanders or an Obama is tremendous, and so much more tremendous than the candidate, and so much more magnificent potentially than the candidate. So I think people aren't told that they're powerful, and everything in the mainstream media in my lifetime in this country has belittled, trivialized, and really censored the power of activism until it's some kind of taxidermized past, like Rosa Parks on that bus.
Or trivialized it in terms of its effectiveness, right?
Yeah, no, and and you see like a corporation like an organization divests from fossil fuels, the last thing they want to credit is the college students who are blockading them. Right. And so the organizations often yield to our influence, usually deny that our influence is what they're yielding to. Right. And so you also have to learn to be a critical reader of the stories being told. And this is why critiquing the status quo and the dominant narrative is important, but it's not enough to critique the dominant narrative. You need to have better narratives.
That's right.
And I don't feel like, some people are really kind of checking out, but I think a lot of people don't realize that they could be checking in some sense, and they haven't been handed that sense. And when they do get it, as they did in moments like Occupy Wall Street, they're like lanterns that have been suddenly lit. They are all aglow with joy, with a sense of their own power, with a sense of connection and possibility and agency and voice. And that's something I wrote about and that's what the book of Paradise Built in Hell is about, is these moments in disasters when people find connection and agency and possibility, power and voice.
And joy, right? It's very striking.
That they find joy. And that's what's amazing. We are constantly told that all our pleasures and satisfactions are private. I always say, before you can privatize an economy, you have to privatize the psyches in it. You have to convince people that we're not deeply connected to each other, that we're not public citizens, that our happiness does not depend on a thriving public sphere, on being a member of a democracy and a civil society. Right. On having meaningful work and agency in the world. We're told that we basically want sex and cuddly family life and lots of nice things. And those are all lovely things. I'm for all of them, but, it feels like it's like, I always think of it as being under house arrest. I want people to have that beautiful home of private interior life. What we don't talk about that also, which is spiritual life to return to.
Absolutely.
But I want them to be able to get out of the house into that outside world and connect to these bigger things. And I think a lot of unhappiness comes from not having those connections. And we don't talk about that. We don't have much psychology and therapy that's like, oh, you're depressed because you're not a member of a healthy civil society. You're depressed because you don't have a voice in your future. You're depressed because you're in a destructive society. And, we need to say that harms us too, and we can resist it.
It does harm us. And, the need to cultivate spiritual sources, the need to cultivate spiritual habits that enable different kinds of political and moral habits is very clear. It's very clear that those needs are out there. Or what you call spaciousness, right? This idea that, one can be out in the world in a radically different way because you're attuned to the world in a way that defies the stories that we've inherited, right? And these dominant narratives that we talked about.
I've been spending some time with Jarvis J. Masters, who's a really remarkable prisoner on death row in San Quentin, an innocent man who's been there since 1990, in prison since he was 19. Like me, he's 54. And what doesn't make his life okay, but makes it miraculous, is the spaciousness he's created from inside a 6-foot by 10-foot cell.
Wow.
And that he's deeply connected to a Tibetan Buddhist community, to these deep friendships with people in the outside world, to ideas and principles and a sense of self. In a sense, prison gives you a narrative that you're no one and you're trapped in this tiny space. And he's made himself into someone and connected, through, I think, open-heartedness and going really deep, and in ways that I think are very self-critical too. But it's really, and it's really kind of profound witnessing his power in the face of this oppression.
I'm wondering. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, let's go.
Yeah, because I just wanted to pick up on that Buddhist note, because I've read sprinklings of that in your writing. And it has made me think a bit about the ways in which Buddhists ask us to rethink our relationship to suffering. Ask us, and that our relationship to suffering, primordially conditions our capacity for compassion.
Yeah, and Buddhism has been one of the more, well, recent, as in the last 16 years or so, influences on me. And it's just such a fantastic alternative system. I think the Western system we're mostly handed says suffering is a failure that you need to run away from and hide and be ashamed of, or, you need to try and fix it. And, and the Bodhisattva vow is just so damn great. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. It's ridiculous. How can you save all beings from all suffering? And what's liberating...
And yet if you don't try, who are we, right?
Exactly. But what also is great about it is it says the task is endless, so set a good pace and don't worry about the fact that you're not done. I have a friend who's watching the refugees coming into Greece, and it's just horrific what she's seeing. And it is interesting where it's like you commit to doing something about it. Yeah. You acknowledge that this is not the way we frame problems often in the left political sphere, where it's like, we'll fix this and then we'll go home. Right. It's like this supply of suffering is infinite. And it's also this thing where it's like you come to terms with it in some way and you don't run away from it and you don't fear it, which doesn't mean it's okay to be on death row. It's not okay to be a Syrian refugee, but it means with your own suffering, it's some of the work that you have to do, and it's one of the things it's going to teach you. And, and so, like, what are you going to do about it? There's some really interesting options.
There are. And, you make a lot in Hope in the Dark about the need to resist the frustration that small victories are not enough, right? And to kind of revel in even small achievements, in the everyday achievements.
Yeah. I think that there's a great fear on the part of the left, which is densely populated with Puritans and perfectionists, that somehow celebrating victory means thinking we've reached the finish line and then we're all going to go home and loll around on our couches. And I have the opposite theory, which is we're not going to get off our couches if we think that we're never going to have any victories. A lot of people think we have no power, we've never had any power, we can't make a difference, and therefore you don't have to get off the couch. Right. And victories are reminders. Something like the same-sex marriage victory of the Supreme Court was it 2014? Or was it 2000? No, it's just 2015. 15. It's a pretty amazing thing where it doesn't mean, as we see with the new legislation in North Carolina yesterday, it doesn't mean that homophobia is defeated for all time and we can forget about it. Just like the civil rights movement doesn't mean that racism, got sent away. But they are landmarks and things are really different. And so I want people to come to terms with contingent, imperfect victories, because this is Earth. Everything's contingent, everything's imperfect. Imperfect is your friend. Impure is your friend. Mm-hmm. I had a wonderful Salvadoran-American electronic musician friend of mine, David Molino, has a band called the Impuritans, and I just love that term. Let us all become Impuritans, because Puritanism is such a curse that you have to be pure, and that you can't work with this group or you can't electoral politics or something, because you have to be pure. And it's like, great, you can be so damn pure that you can't do anything, see anything, say anything, touch anything. And what are you going to do from there?
So is the drive to the Puritan drive is almost it strikes me as I'm listening to you as a detachment from living, right? As a detachment from suffering, it's right?
Cynicism. Yeah. But it's also about the purification. Another idea that's really important to me in Buddhism that I think a lot of Westerners are very confused about. They think the point of Buddhism is to become enlightened. And the Bodhisattva vow is to strenuously avoid enlightenment because you've got work to do. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Mm-hmm. Becoming enlightened gets you off the wheel of birth and death. Mm-hmm. The Bodhisattva vow is to keep being born, keep coming back, keep doing the work. You're strenuous, you're pursuing some wisdom to be better at the work, but you're not taking care of you and to pursue enlightenment is to take care of yourself. To pursue compassion for all beings is to take care of all creation. It's a very different calling. And I think it's I think that it's actually present in the ways a lot of like Franciscan activist monks and nuns I've met operate in the world. I think that that calling is present in all religions and a lot of secular people, but we don't really acknowledge that, and it's funny, I think a lot of activists a lot of people who think they're activists are not activists. They're pursuing self-purification, and they're actually not doing anything. I sometimes lately have been thinking one of the big problems with what we call activism is about half the people in there are not activists. They're not getting up in the morning and throwing their weight into changing the world. They're sitting around armchair quarterbacking, being what the great climate writer David Roberts calls what is it? He has this great term. It's like the not good enough coalition. They're sitting around explaining why 350.org isn't enough, why the Sierra Club. And a lot of times they're not even fucking informed. Right. Like a lot of people are criticizing the Sierra Club for things that have not been true of it in many years, or things they didn't get right in the first place. And
it speaks to a kind of it's a kind of moral laziness, right? Because it's easier to reside in things that you think are right and wrong, as opposed to doing the hard work.
Yeah, you think are wrong. And something I see constantly, for example. Recently, they passed legislation in D.C. that allows us to export unrefined crude oil. That's a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And if a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And so lots of people were running around like, oh, that's a very bad thing. And it's like, do you know that was a trade-off? And in return, we got a 5-year extension on renewable energy subsidies. And if you crunch the numbers, as some really smart climate journalists did, the carbon impact of the exporting the crude is greatly outweighed by the carbon reduction. And so it's like, if you look at the big picture, it's not so bad. It's not pure. It's not, exporting crude is not a good thing, but like, look at it in the system, do your homework, see the big picture before you open your mouth.
So how do we get folks, I mean, this is part of what got us started in this Love Driven Politics project in the first place. Like, how do you convince folks of the need to dive into complexity, but also the necessity of compromise, right? I mean, because, the Puritans, as you described them, are seeking an ideological purity because, it wants to foreclose options, right?
Yeah.
Folks don't really want to listen, and they don't actually want to engage in real argument, right? They just want agreement. And so how do we get folks to really argue?
I think you talk about love-based politics, so I'm hoping to hear some about it, because I think that's what it is. I'm writing my most recent column for Harper's, which is called The 7 Habits of Highly Cynical People. And I really realize that a lot of people are permanently on the defensive, and I think a lot of left culture is a culture of attack. You're not pure enough, you're morally compromised, you weren't there in 68 or 89 or 99, you're white, you're straight, you're cis, you're bourgeois, you're tenured, the list of sins is endless. Yeah. And so people feel like they're constantly in the Salem witch trials or the McCarthy purges or something, and in a funny way, the best defense is an offense, and so they're constantly trying to prove they're pure, and that other people, that they're pure enough, and other people are not pure enough, and so you get into this kind of arms race. And if we run our conversations, and it's sort of like, I want to save the world, except and ultimately. And you start looking at, how do you do that? Well, it's like we get people. And it's this thing where you come down from this really big thing, like how do we change the emissions going into the atmosphere that dictates our climate? And it comes back in some ways to, we need to have conversations where people feel safe so they can not know things, including what are the trade-offs? What does this mean? Yeah. They can recognize what they don't know, and they can also know that we don't know what's going to happen. Are we going to win the tar sands pipeline battle? Are we going to win the same? And so I feel like, and that's where compassion comes in. Is there a way we can make people feel safer and more generous and more open-hearted? What would happen with the movement? And I think some of that happened in Occupy, not perfectly, and it was full of crazy, wound up, over-caffeinated young New Yorkers. And over-educated, over-caffeinated, wound up New Yorkers who are very good at parsing differences and being critical. But there was a lot of deep generosity. And even the idea of the 99% was like, almost all of us have this great thing in common. We're not going to say working class and middle class, which is a false division, because mostly what we call middle class people are people who are still working for a living and still living in precariousness. And in this day when adjuncts make so much less than plumbers, so it's like, how can we not be so divisive? How can we trust each other? How can we stop scaring each other? How can we stop having a politics of competition and scarcity, even in how we talk about the everyday things? And and I think that you have to build, like, these are the tiny bricks you build the palace out of.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, for the kind of love-driven politics that a group of us have been working on, have been very much focused on things like compassion, about mercy, about forgiveness. So one of the striking things about Occupy was that there were at least a suspension of guilt and blame, right? So these kinds of joyfulness, right?
That way, yeah.
And I'll tell you a story. I went out to Zuccotti Park with a friend who's about a decade older than me, and considered himself a kind of '60s radical. And he walked around Zuccotti Park, and he was scowling. He's saying, like, "Who are all these people? They're not organized like we were," and so on and so forth. And I had this huge giddy grin on my face, and I was ecstatic. I thought, like, wow, look at all these people here. I mean, there's this library, and one of the things that was most impressive to me was the patience people had. You don't know something. Let me. Here's a book. Let me talk to you about it. Let me teach you something about that. And that was extremely inspiring.
Part of what was so beautiful to me about Occupy is that we literally phone it in. We're busy. We're distracted. We're constantly mediated by our technologies. And it was, I think, in a funny way, a new generation suddenly discovered the joy, beauty, intimacy, power, and spirit of simply sitting and being present. And the fact that nobody planned it to be a 2-month occupation and a global movement, that the power of just sitting together and having deep conversation about what it all meant and what our dreams are was so tremendous that people who came to sit for a day stayed overnight and then stayed for 2 months. And it spread. There was Occupy Auckland in New Zealand. I met some people who were part of Occupy Kyoto. It was a beautiful, beautiful thing. And part of the dumb arithmetic people do is like, well, it didn't destroy capitalism. And that's a big part of my hopeful work, is saying we need more subtle calculation. And that piece I just mentioned, the 7 Habits of Highly Cynical People, I talk about people have a sense of history like it was bowling. Like our efforts are the bowling ball. They either knocked down those 9 pins right now or they didn't, and that's all there is to it. And something like Occupy, if it's a bowling ball, it's a bowling ball that mysteriously multiplies in the night into 1,000 places, keeps moving, and that knocks down pins you'll never see or dream of, and pins that weren't set up yet when it started bowling. And I hate to create beautiful mystical visions of bowling, but I wanted to take something, as dumb and direct as bowling and say, like, you look at Occupy, and like all these amazing homeless and police accountability projects on very local scales came out of it. Occupy Sandy, Strike Debt. On a statewide reform on mortgages and debt and things like that, and a complete shift in the conversation. One of the things that I feel, when a new event happens, it suddenly throws the past into a different light. And I feel like recently I've realized after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was all this ridiculous triumphalism about capitalism lost, communism lost, capitalism won. Right. And communism had lost, or the totalitarian state version that they had, but it didn't, there was no corollary that capitalism had won. And what's really interesting, when you look at how many people have warm, fuzzy responses to socialism now, how much people distrust corporations, banks, capitalism, and the elite, which is one of the things Occupy was really a big left turn in the road on. You're like, oh, capitalism, like we have divorced ourselves from capitalism in a big way. We don't yet have a beautiful alternative vision, but like backing off from the legitimacy of slavery or the subjugation of women, this is a huge change.
It is a huge change. One of the touchstones for me from the Occupy moment and movement was the piece you did for Tom Dispatch. You quoted one of the activists saying, "Compassion is our currency."
Oh yeah, that's a wonderful cardboard sign this exceptionally scruffy kid was holding up. And the thing I quoted even yesterday and quote all the time is an old woman who said to a video camera, "We are fighting." I think she was holding a sign. I'm going to do a shout out someday and see if I can get a picture. "We are fighting for a world in which everyone matters."
There you go.
And, that has become one of my kind of operating principles where it's like, well, what are we doing with feminism? What are we doing with Black Lives Matter? What are we doing with the climate movement that is also a justice and human rights movement? And what are we doing? It's like we're fighting. If fighting's the right verb, we're working, we're dreaming for, we're building for.
And asking to imagine.
We're studying for, we're imagining for a world in which everyone matters.
Yeah, when I've given talks of late about radical love and love-driven politics, what I'll do, I've often quoted that compassion is our currency and tied it to the Black Lives Matter student movements on campuses where they'll hold up these signs that say, "I am loved," right?
That's so amazing. And it's so interesting how hard it is for the media, which created these really handy dismissive terms in the 60s and won't let go of that, like, just like feminists are all angry and strident. And, there's all that, what are they so angry about by people who don't want to know and don't want to see that. It's not just anger that's there. And it's been really interesting seeing the young, who many of whom are just so remarkable, find these new openings and new ways of being and connecting and defining and undefining.
And those young folks are connecting to that older activist you just described, where they're insisting on their worthiness of love. Right?
Yeah.
And so that's, to me, like the power of this moment around racial politics, the power of this moment around the environmental movement and the debt movement, is this insistence that, the folks who suffer there are actual human beings worthy of dignity, worthy of integrity, worthy of respect, and worthy of love. And so, if we can find spaces, even just to make that acknowledgement first, as you say in the book, hope isn't sufficient for action, but it's a basis for it, right? And so, like, how do you open that space up?
It's interesting because we do have these intense movements of hate from ISIS to Trump.
That's right.
Kind of raging across the earth too. And it's interesting looking at what does that offer people and why is that appealing? And I think certainty is part of it, which is part of why we need to be skeptical about certainty. It offers us easy explanations, us and them. The idea that we don't have to defeat what's ugly in ourselves. It's all out there in them and we just have to defeat them. And of course the left has its own version. I think a lot about not only do we need to talk about police killings, but we need to talk about those moments in which we police each other in ways that are not okay. And, the way that patriarchy polices women's bodies and women's freedoms, the way that, racism polices people of color and criminalizes them and limits their freedom of movement, the way, but the young are they're in so many kinds of revolt. The revolt against gender itself, as like, I decline to be defined by these categories.
That's right.
Talk about coming to terms with uncertainty. Like that is such an,
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I don't need binaries and rules to define what my body is and how I love it and how it loves other people and how they love it. And that's a revolution nobody really saw coming, or some I think people did, but I don't think many of us saw it coming.
Well, and maybe this is the note to end on, that the revolution is one that is still happening and will continue to happen, right? And that our hope for the change is not for the final revolution, but for our capacity to participate in an ongoing way.
Exactly. There's that horrible 60s half-joking thing people would still say when I was younger, after the revolution. And it's partly because they had this kind of Cuban Soviet model that they would overthrow the government and then everything would be beautiful. And it's this thing where the day after the government's overthrown, are you the same person you were the day before?
Mm.
If you are, then what kind of a revolution was that? And yeah, we need to change finance and agriculture and everything else, but we also need to recognize that there's so many revolutions that we are in the midst of.
That's right.
Yeah, that
That's
finishable. Right. That the revolution is full of victories, full of things that we need to do, and is imperfect and pure and unfinishable and delicious.
And it's happening on different scales. Rebeccca Solnit, I'm so grateful to be in this conversation with you. And I've been thinking, as I've been rereading your work, and thinking of you as the lyricist of our songs of hope.
Oh man, I want to come out and have more conversations with your compatriots.
Absolutely.
I need more of this.
And you are absolutely invited and welcome at any time, Rebeccca. Thank you so much for this time.
Thank you. Keep in touch.
All right.